It started with an email, no subject line, no sender. Just a short message in a clean serif font. You are cordially invited to an auction held at 34 Henner's Vale. Friday, midnight. That was it. No RSVP instructions, no additional details. I read it multiple times before dismissing it as spam dressed up with a little class. But that address nagged at me. Henner's Vale was on the edge of town, far from where most people lived, surrounded by tall ancient oaks and narrow roads that always looked wet even in summer. I hadn't been near it since I was a kid, when my friends dared me to bike down that stretch after dark. I only got halfway. Still, something about the simplicity of the message kept resurfacing in my mind over the next couple of days. By the time Friday came around, I was checking the time every hour. It was curiosity, not belief, that led me to dress in black and drive out after 11. The roads thinned until it was just me, the pines, and the occasional turn that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I almost missed the turnoff. The mailbox was old and painted over, the numbers almost invisible in the dark. I followed the gravel path through the trees, and as it opened up, I saw lights in the distance, dim, warm, flickering like candles through stained glass. There were cars already parked, a neat line of them half buried in mist. I pulled in behind a faded blue sedan and stepped out. The cold was sharp, biting the tips of my fingers through the gloves I wore, and for a moment, the wind brought a smell like freshly dug earth and something else I couldn't name. The house sat in the clearing like it had always been there, squat and wide, with ivy strangling its porch beams. Someone stood at the entrance, a tall man in a suit, his face too far in shadow to read. He didn't speak when I approached, just opened the door and gestured for me to enter. Inside was warmer, lit by oil lamps and a few scattered chandeliers that looked like they hadn't been dusted in a decade. The other attendees wore black or gray. No one spoke. They sat in wooden chairs, all facing a long oak table at the front of the room. Behind it stood a figure in a dark coat, his voice calm as he read from a list. Each grave comes with benefits, he said. Material, financial, situational. Each grave also comes with conditions, rules, enforcement. He glanced up as if looking at each of us in turn. Your compliance is not optional. Your participation has already begun. Papers were passed down the rows. A list of grave numbers, each followed by a starting bid and a location: country roads, forgotten lots, private woods. I hadn't brought money, but that didn't seem to matter. When it came time to bid, I raised my hand almost on instinct for grave number 43. It was the only one listed without a location, just a latitude and longitude. No one else bid. The man behind the table nodded. Sold. After the auction, I was handed a thin envelope. Inside was a single page, aged and textured like old parchment, the ink slightly smudged in places. The writing was precise and printed. At the top, rules for grave number 43. They were laid out clearly. Rule 1. Do not speak to the man with no eyes if he appears sitting atop the grave. He may offer you answers, secrets, or bargains. If you speak, you accept his offer. If you accept, your body will remain, but your mind will sit in that grave forever. Rule 2. Never speak about the grave's rewards. Not to friends. Not to strangers. Not even in dreams. If someone else speaks about the grave without prompting, they are not human. Leave the room calmly, never turning your back. If they follow, you must run to the grave and speak the words carved into its base aloud before they catch you. Rule 3. Within 72 hours of claiming the grave, someone you know will die violently. Do not mourn publicly. If you cry where others can see, your face will be carved into the corpse's skin. Rule 4. Visit the grave a minimum of twice a week for 10 minutes each time. If you fail, a woman dressed in black will begin to stalk you. Each day you go without visiting, she will get closer. The longer you avoid the grave, the more she will appear in your peripheral vision, and when she's close enough, she will harm you. Only a visit to the grave will make her distance from you. Rule 5. Each time you visit the grave, you must walk around it 3 times, never more, never less. If you forget, the spirits of those buried in the area will follow you, whispering your name and pulling at your clothes until you return and complete the ritual. If you ignore it, they will grow more violent. Rule 6. The hands despise warmth. If you visit the grave during cold weather and forget to wear boots, they will target your ankles. They'll pull until your bones pop and your legs dislocate. The more exposed your skin is to the cold soil, the more determined they'll be to drag you beneath it. Rule 7. If the grave is ever surrounded by insects, you must not kill any of them. Doing so will result in something crawling into your mouth while you sleep and nesting. There was no signature, no indication of who had written them. The bottom of the page was burned slightly at the edge. I folded it up, placed it in my pocket, and said nothing. The coordinates led to a clearing about 45 minutes from the auction site, tucked in the middle of a forest that looked like no one had touched it in years. I parked at the edge of the trail and walked in. It wasn't far. The air grew colder as I moved deeper, the trees thick enough to block most of the moonlight. I stepped into the clearing with a crunch of dead leaves and saw the grave. It wasn't fancy, just a flat stone with no name, no date. There was something carved into the base, shallow and weather-worn, a phrase I couldn't quite make out unless I crouched beside it. I read it silently, not daring to say it aloud. I stood there for a long while, not thinking anything in particular. The quiet wasn't peaceful, but it wasn't hostile either. When I circled the grave 3 times and left, I felt a kind of expectation lingering in the woods, as though something had started. Nothing changed right away, though I noticed the envelope from the auction never wrinkled, no matter how many times I read the rules or carried it in my coat pocket. It always looked newly printed. I went to work. I answered emails. I avoided people. 48 hours after I claimed the grave, I got a call from my cousin's wife. Her voice was small. She said it was an accident, that he'd lost control on a back road and crashed into a telephone pole. There wasn't an open casket. I didn't go to the funeral. I stayed inside that day and didn't cry even when I wanted to. I stared at the wall and breathed through my teeth, focusing on not making a sound. I think I stopped blinking for a while. On the 4th day, I went back to the grave. It had rained the night before and the ground was cold and wet. I wore boots just in case. As I walked around it for the first time that visit, I saw something small wriggling near the base. Insects. A cluster of them, black and iridescent, gathering around the stone like they belonged there. I didn't touch them. I didn't even brush them away when one crawled up the side of my boot. I did my 3 circles, stood for the 10 minutes, then walked back without turning to look again. That night, I slept with my mouth tightly shut. Small things changed. My phone wouldn't take photos near the grave. When I tried, the screen went static. One time, it cracked outright. The next time, I brought a disposable camera just to test it. The photos came back blank except for one, which showed a man-shaped figure crouched on the stone with no visible eyes or face, his arms resting casually on his knees. My heart dropped. I didn't ask anyone about it. I didn't tell a soul. I told myself that in a few days I'll return to the grave again. I'm already planning it. I keep track of the days obsessively, count them backward and forward. I can't risk missing a visit. There are times now when I feel like I'm being watched, not directly, but through reflections. Windows, puddles, even the curve of a spoon. Once, while brushing my teeth, I saw the black shape of a woman behind me in the mirror's edge. I turned. Nothing. But I was a day late visiting. I didn't wait another day. I left the house that night and stayed by the grave until sunrise, pacing around it 3 times, hands shoved into my coat pockets, boots wet from the soil. I think I heard something whispering once. Just a single word. My name. I told myself it was the wind moving through the trees, but it wasn't. Nothing about this is that simple. And yet every time I go back, the rewards make themselves known. Money has started to appear in places I'd forgotten to check, drawers I hadn't opened in months, coat pockets, boxes I packed years ago. But I never speak about it. Not to anyone. I barely think about it when I'm awake. I've started dreaming more often now, and that's where the rules are hardest to keep. Dreams don't feel safe anymore. Last night, someone I used to work with asked me where the money came from. I remembered Rule 2 even while asleep, and I walked away. When I turned around, she was gone, but something else was in her place, staring at me with the same face. It smiled, and I woke up with my teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached. I didn't bother trying to sleep again after that. The dream had left a residue, not just in my mouth or jaw, but in the room itself, like the air had shifted. I opened the window slightly just to test something. The wind didn't move the curtain. It didn't touch my skin either, just passed by the room as if it didn't belong to this place anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed with the lights off for a while, staring at nothing, and by the time morning came, I couldn't remember blinking once. The next few days dragged. I stayed away from everyone. Not out of paranoia, but because I didn't want to test myself. If someone slipped and mentioned the grave, I didn't know if I had the strength to run straight there and recite whatever was carved into the base. I didn't even want to see that carving yet. I hadn't looked closely at it when I first claimed the grave, too caught up in what I'd gotten myself into. Now it felt like it was waiting for me to forget that detail, to need it in a moment of panic and find that I'd never actually committed it to memory. There was a stillness around everything I did. I moved slower. I spoke less. I watched people closer. On the 5th day, I went to the grocery store just to feel normal for a while. Nothing happened, but I noticed something strange in the frozen food aisle. A little girl was standing in front of the glass doors with her hand pressed to the frost, not moving, not looking at anyone. Her mother stood nearby talking on the phone, completely unaware that her daughter hadn't moved in minutes. I walked past them and didn't look back. I hadn't seen the girl before, but she stared like she recognized me. That night, something scratched at the inside of the bathroom mirror. Not loudly, just enough to pull my attention when I passed by. I didn't stop. I didn't turn the light on. I didn't go near the mirror again until sunrise. Day 6 was quiet. I made my second visit to the grave that evening, just before the sky went fully dark. The cemetery felt tighter than it did the first time, narrower, more compact, like the rows had rearranged slightly. I didn't linger on it. I walked my 3 laps without pause, counted them aloud to myself without stumbling, and stood beside the grave for the full 10 minutes. The dirt hadn't shifted. The marker hadn't cracked. Nothing had changed. I didn't speak, didn't think anything I wouldn't want overheard. On my way out, I noticed a trail of insects about 5 feet from the grave, small, harmless, but clustered too deliberately. I took a wide step around them and didn't crush a single one. That felt important. Back home, the apartment had a smell I couldn't place. Not rot, not mold, but something that didn't belong to buildings. I checked the walls, the closets, even behind the fridge. Nothing. I didn't see anything, but that smell didn't fade. I left the windows open that night. The breeze never came in. Just more of that same dead air. I didn't dream, but I did wake up with blood under my fingernails. Not a lot. Just enough to make me check my arms, then my neck, then my gums. Everything was clean. I trimmed my nails short that morning and washed my hands twice. On the 7th day, I saw the woman in black for the first time. Not up close. Not fully. Just standing across the street as I threw a garbage bag into the bin outside. She wasn't moving. I couldn't make out her face, but her head was tilted slightly to the side and she stood in a way that made it clear she wasn't confused about where she was or why she was there. I looked away, walked back inside, and waited by the peephole. By the time I checked again, she was gone. That was the first day I stopped checking the weather forecast and just assumed I'd need boots from now on. I kept them by the door. I kept my phone charged. I memorized the walk to the grave in case I ever had to make it at full speed. I started sleeping in short bursts, always with one eye open toward the hallway. I hadn't spoken to anyone in person in over a week. The messages on my phone piled up. I didn't answer. On the 8th day, the buzz of city life outside my window felt quieter than usual. Not silent, just less. Like the world had taken a half step back from itself. Cars still passed, people still moved on sidewalks, but the sounds carried differently, like they'd been muffled by a layer I couldn't see. I didn't go out that morning. I sat near the window with a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching for anything out of place, though I wasn't sure I'd recognize what out of place meant anymore. Everything felt slightly wrong in ways I couldn't explain. It had been nearly 3 days since my last visit to the grave, and I already knew I'd be going back later that night. Not because I felt her watching me, though I was sure she still was, but because the idea of skipping that ritual made my skin tighten. I didn't want to test how long I had. I didn't want to find out how close she could get. I kept my boots near the door and triple-checked that the laces weren't torn. The last thing I wanted was to rush to the grave in cold weather and discover my ankles were exposed to the soil. I remembered Rule 6 too vividly. There was a pressure growing in my apartment, like each object had gained weight. The couch cushions didn't sink the same when I sat down. The fridge door resisted when I pulled it open. Even the light switches clicked with more effort. I didn't say anything out loud anymore, not even to myself. Talking felt risky, like something might answer back. That afternoon, I got a phone call. I didn't recognize the number. I let it ring twice, then denied it. A few minutes later, a voicemail came through. I didn't listen. The notification icon stared at me until I finally opened the app and deleted it without hitting play. I felt like it would have known if I listened. Later, I walked to the grave with the boots on, scarf tight around my neck. The temperature had dropped since my last visit. I counted every step without speaking. When I reached the grave, I noticed 2 fresh indentations in the soil near the headstone, as if someone had knelt there. No footprints led up to them, no other signs of movement in the dirt. I stepped around them and started the ritual, circling the grave 3 times, keeping count in my head. I paused only briefly when I caught something out of the corner of my eye, just movement in the tree-line. A branch swaying too stiffly. A shape standing where no shadow should be. I finished the 3rd lap and stood by the grave. I waited. 10 minutes. I didn't look at my phone, didn't shift my feet, didn't let my thoughts drift. I stayed still and focused. Before I left, I glanced at the base of the grave. I made myself memorize the words carved into it. 6 words, all uppercase, etched deep into the stone. They were sharp, clean, like they'd been cut recently. I repeated them in my head until they felt natural. Not because I thought I'd need them yet, but because not knowing them had started to feel like walking through traffic with my eyes closed. I left the grave slower than I came in. The path looked longer on the way back. Not winding, not changing, just stretched like it wanted to see how long I'd walk before noticing. I didn't look behind me. That night, something knocked on the wall behind my bed. Not the door. Not the window. The wall. I waited for it to happen again. It didn't. When I stood and tapped the same spot, it sounded solid. No pipes, no vibration. Just drywall and insulation. I returned to bed, lay flat, stared up, and told myself it could have been the building settling, even though I already knew better. I dreamed again. This time, I stood alone in a church or something close to one. Long pews stretched into darkness behind me. Candles floated without flames. At the far end of the room, where an altar should have been, was the grave. The same one I'd claimed. But it wasn't in the ground anymore. It stood upright, stone rising like a monument, and the man with no eyes sat on top of it, arms resting on his knees, head cocked slightly to the side as if trying to listen without ears. He didn't speak. Neither did I. The space between us thickened, and though he never moved, the distance kept shrinking like the room was collapsing inward. He smiled once. Just once. And the dream ended. I woke up with a line of dirt across my chest, smeared unevenly like someone had tried to draw something but stopped halfway. I changed the sheets and didn't bother saving them. The next day, I forced myself to leave the apartment for a few hours, not because I felt safe outside, but because staying inside for too long made things start to feel thinner, more exposed. I went to a library 2 neighborhoods away, a place with fluorescent lighting and wide tables where no one talks loudly. I stayed for hours, reading nothing, scrolling through nothing, just watching people exist around me. A man 2 tables over leaned across his chair toward a woman and said something I couldn't hear. She laughed, but her eyes never left me. Not once. She didn't blink while laughing. I left not long after that. At home, everything was exactly where I left it. The boots were still by the door. The curtains were still drawn tight. But there was a smell. Not rot or mold, but deeper. I lit a match and let it burn down to my fingers before dropping it in the sink. The smell didn't change. That night, I slept for an hour at most. The rest of the time, I listened. Not for specific sounds, but for movement, pressure. Around 4 a.m., I thought I saw someone standing just past the end of the hallway near the bathroom door. A figure, very still, slightly leaning. I didn't get up to check. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the hallway was empty. But the bathroom mirror had fogged up slightly, like someone had been breathing near it. I wiped it clean with a towel and left the light on. I've been keeping a notebook now. I don't write in it often, just enough to track time. To remember when I last visited the grave, when the rules started to feel closer to consequences. The notebook doesn't leave the apartment. I never speak the rules aloud. I've been tempted, but I haven't broken them. Not once. Something tells me they're waiting for that. The morning after the bathroom mirror fogged over without reason, I stood in the kitchen longer than I needed to. The kettle had already boiled, steam trailing lazily upward, but I didn't pour the water. I just stood there, eyes fixed on the window above the sink. There was condensation on the glass, but it hadn't rained. The window was shut. The radiator below it wasn't even on. I touched the glass. It was warm. Not hot, not cold, warm like a forehead. I left it alone and walked away without drying my hand. The faint print I left behind stayed visible even after I turned the corner into the hallway. I didn't look back to check if it was still there. I didn't want to know. That day I kept mostly to one room, the furthest one from the front door. Something had started making small clicking sounds near the door frame just once every few hours, too far apart to follow a rhythm. I tried to tell myself it was the wood contracting or settling, but the sound didn't match. It didn't echo like natural material, it sounded deliberate, like a fingernail tapping slow and soft. I stayed out of the front room entirely. Whatever was causing the noise wasn't trying to hide anymore, but it wasn't in a rush either. That was what unsettled me most, the patience. I opened the notebook again that evening, drawing a rough timeline with no real pattern, just trying to place each moment that had felt off. It was filling faster than I liked. I flipped to the back and rewrote the rules from memory just to make sure I hadn't missed anything. 7 rules. No more, no less. I whispered none of them. Even inside my head, I was careful not to recite them too quickly. If there were something listening, I didn't want it to know how often I thought about them. That night, I walked to the graveyard again. I didn't wait for anything to happen first. I went before anything could shift closer. The air was drier, and though it hadn't snowed, the cold was deeper than it had been all week. My breath hung in front of me, but the ground hadn't frozen, which made each step feel like I was pressing my boots into something just soft enough to react. As I approached the grave, I noticed someone had placed a single coin at the base of the headstone. Old currency, worn thin. I didn't touch it. I walked around the grave 3 times, counting carefully, moving evenly. The wind picked up slightly after the second lap, but I didn't let it distract me. I finished the 3rd and stood at the foot of the grave. Nothing moved. No insects, no sound. But something had changed. I could feel it in my shoes, in the way the ground held my weight. I didn't stay past the 10-minute mark. On my way out of the cemetery, I noticed a figure 3 rows over, standing still behind a taller gravestone. They weren't watching me directly, but their head was tilted down like they were studying the name beneath their feet. I kept walking. I made no effort to speed up, didn't look again until I reached the gates. When I turned, the spot was empty. The gravestone that had been partially hidden behind them wasn't there. Just grass. At home, I checked the boots before taking them off. The soles were covered in small grains of something that looked too pale to be dirt. I scraped some of it off into a napkin and tossed it in the bin. There was a smell again, not as strong but unmistakable. The kind that stuck to the inside of your nose and didn't go away no matter how often you wiped it. I washed my hands and turned on the TV for background noise, even though I didn't want to hear anything. I wasn't trying to distract myself. I just didn't want to listen to the apartment. I muted it after 5 minutes. It didn't help. I slept on the couch with my back to the wall, eyes toward the hallway. No dreams, but I woke up once when the light flickered. Just once, for a second. No power outage. Nothing else turned off. Just that bulb blinking once as if it had blinked back. I didn't fall asleep again. The next day, someone rang my buzzer. Not the front door, the downstairs entrance. I waited. They didn't press it again. No footsteps on the stairwell. No voice through the intercom. Just one ring, then silence. I walked down 2 hours later. There was nothing waiting. No package. No note. But there was a small pile of soil on the first step, shaped almost like a footprint but too shallow to be from a shoe. I vacuumed it up. Didn't take a photo. Didn't want it stored on my phone. Later that evening, I went to a nearby cafe to be around people for a bit. Not to talk, just to sit near others. The noise of public spaces still felt safer than the apartment. I took a seat near the window and opened a book I had no intention of reading. A couple sat behind me talking softly. I tuned them out until I heard one of them say the word grave. I froze. They kept speaking, the man whispering something about rewards, about how quickly it all came after. I turned my head just slightly, watching their reflection in the glass. They weren't looking at each other. Both of them were watching me. I stood, left the book behind, and walked straight out the door. I didn't run. I didn't speak. Just left. I didn't turn my back once. When I got outside, I headed for the graveyard without even going home first. By the time I reached the headstone, the wind had picked up again, stronger this time. The branches above creaked under the pressure, and the air stung when it touched my face. I walked around the grave 3 times again, slower than before, counting with the rhythm of my steps. The stone felt colder. The writing at its base almost shimmered in the moonlight. I stood there, repeating the carved words silently, one by one, lips never moving. It was then I noticed the insects. A small collection of them crawling slowly from beneath the soil just past the edge of the grave. They didn't move toward me. They didn't scatter. They just gathered. I stood still. I watched them. I did not step on any. I didn't move until the full 10 minutes passed. Back at the apartment, I checked every surface, every wall, every corner. I hadn't brought any of the insects back with me. Nothing crawled, nothing shifted. I poured a glass of water, and only once it was full did I realize I could hear breathing that wasn't mine. It wasn't in the room, it was layered under the sound of the faucet behind the splash. I turned the tap off. The sound stopped. I didn't try to explain it. I didn't try to recreate it. I poured the water down the drain and went to bed without brushing my teeth. I haven't seen the woman in black yet, but I felt her. At the edge of a crowd, by a store window, just out of frame when I glanced toward reflective surfaces. I know I'm not being followed exactly, she isn't behind me. She's waiting. And she's patient. The rules haven't changed. I haven't broken them, but I'm beginning to see how tight they are, how little space they leave for error. 3 days after the encounter at the cafe, I checked my account on a whim. I wasn't expecting anything, just scrolling through routine balances, but the number there wasn't what it should have been. It was higher, a lot higher. Not suspiciously impossible, but far enough outside the range of normal that I stared at it longer than I should have. The deposit came from a sender marked only as Estate of MG. I hadn't inherited anything. I hadn't even known anyone with those initials. But the money was real, transferable, spendable. I didn't touch it that day. I let it sit there, untouched like a baited hook. But the next morning, my phone buzzed with a notification, an offer for an exclusive account upgrade, something I'd never qualified for before. And when I walked to the corner store, the clerk who usually barely acknowledged me offered me free coffee, smiling like he knew me. These weren't coincidences. They were acknowledgments. Whatever I'd been given, whatever that grave was linked to, it was starting to pull on the world around me. The wealth was arriving in pieces, not just money, but favor, small opportunities, unnatural luck. I hadn't applied for anything, but a letter came in the mail saying a credit issue I'd forgotten about had been wiped clear. No explanation, just a notice that my balance was now zero. I went to the grave again that night. It had become routine now, but not in a way that brought comfort. I didn't forget the rules. I never would. I wore my boots, thick-soled, well-sealed, because the temperature had dipped sharply and the sky was clear, but the wind had that dry, cutting edge that hinted at frost. I arrived a few minutes before midnight. The cemetery gates hadn't been locked, which wasn't unusual, but I did notice they were already slightly open when I arrived. I stepped through without touching them. The grave looked undisturbed at first glance, but the ground surrounding it had a different texture. Slightly sunken. Not collapsed, but not flat either. As if the soil had been stirred from beneath. I kept my eyes low, walked around it 3 times, and stood still. The coin I'd seen earlier was gone now, but in its place was a smooth, white stone I hadn't noticed before. No markings. No scratches. I didn't touch it. The air didn't feel like wind. It pressed in short bursts, moving only around the grave. Everything outside its radius felt untouched. 10 minutes passed. Nothing rose. Nothing moved. But when I left, I noticed a second figure far off between the trees. Not like the one I'd seen before. This one was crouched low, almost hunched, like it had grown from the roots instead of stepping in from outside. I didn't slow my walk. I didn't stop to look. The next day, the light in my hallway stayed on even after I'd flipped the switch. It flickered once, then held a dull glow, humming low. I unscrewed the bulb and it went dark, but an hour later it came back on. Same bulb. No power surge. No visible reason. I started using only candlelight in the evenings. I kept my boots by the door and never left them on the floor overnight. The wealth kept coming in subtle layers. A scratch-off ticket I hadn't meant to buy won me $300. I received an email from an old freelance client offering to double my original rate for a project I barely remembered. The rewards weren't flashy, but they were constant, persistent, designed to keep me bound by curiosity and benefit. But the tension was growing. The faucet in the bathroom began dripping, even when tightly sealed. I heard muffled sounds from the plug hole at night, short, wet movements. Nothing ever came out. Yet, in the reflection of the bathroom mirror, I once saw something moving behind me while brushing my teeth. But when I turned, there was no one there. The toothbrush slipped out of my mouth, and when I looked back at the mirror, my reflection hadn't caught up. For a second, it just stood there, mouth slightly open, staring. Then it blinked, and the movement returned to normal. I didn't sleep that night. One evening, I received a voicemail from a number not stored in my contacts. I didn't answer the call when it rang. The message was less than 10 seconds, and it contained only a single breath, long, quiet, steady, like someone had been holding the phone near their mouth while watching something. I deleted it, but the next morning, the same message had returned, showing as a new notification. I turned my phone off for the day and left it in a drawer. On my way to the grave that week, I saw a woman in black crossing the road 2 blocks ahead of me. She didn't turn. She didn't slow. She didn't walk with the rest of the pedestrians. She moved in a direct line toward a street I knew had no exit. I didn't follow. I simply noted the direction and kept my route unchanged. The cemetery was still, but the grave had new claw-like scrapes along the earth nearby. Thin grooves that began a few inches from the headstone and trailed outward, like something had tried to crawl from beneath and given up halfway. No sign of who or what made them. I walked the circle 3 times. Exactly. I didn't look at the trees. I didn't listen for anything behind me. When the 10 minutes were over, I left. I walked home slowly and said nothing to anyone on the way. But when I got inside, something small scuttled into the vent near the floorboards. Too fast to catch. Too quiet to follow. I haven't spoken about the wealth to anyone. No one's asked. But people around me have started acting different. Like they sense it, even if they don't know what it is. A coworker I haven't seen in months messaged me, asking how I turned things around so fast. I didn't answer. I blocked the number. I've seen two separate strangers outside my apartment just standing, once in the morning, once at dusk. They didn't knock or speak, just looked toward the windows and then walked off. Each time I checked the lock twice before I went to sleep. The grave is still giving, and I know now that it will never stop giving unless I stop returning. That night I didn't sleep. I lay on my side with the blanket pulled halfway over my head, my back to the bedroom window, refusing to look at it no matter how much I thought I heard a tap or a subtle shift behind the glass. My apartment was too quiet, not the kind of silence that felt natural, but the kind that felt controlled, like something was muting the world just outside the walls. I tried turning on the TV and the screen lit up, but the sound wouldn't work no matter how high I raised the volume. The light from the hallway began to flicker. It wasn't the bulb. I could feel that something was interfering, like there was pressure building behind the walls, a presence watching and squeezing until the circuits themselves began to react. I stared at my front door and saw the chain move slightly. Not the door, just the chain. I stayed up until daylight bled through the curtains, and even then, I waited another hour before I moved. That morning, I visited the grave early, just as the fog began to lift. I didn't bother eating or showering. I drove with dry lips and a pounding behind my eyes, repeating the same sentence in my head with every mile. 10 minutes, 3 times. Don't forget. As I entered the cemetery, something felt wrong in the way the birds were circling above. They weren't moving freely. They hovered low, like they were trapped between the clouds and the ground, wings twitching as though something was holding them there, forcing them to loop in place over the graveyard like vultures with nowhere to land. I parked further down the road, too anxious to use the nearby lot. The second my boots hit the grass, my ears popped hard and stayed that way until I reached the grave. The stone was darker than I remembered, not from shadow, but something else, something seeping up from the soil beneath it. The color reminded me of dried blood smeared into wet concrete. I checked my watch and stood there exactly 10 minutes, eyes low, hands still, reciting the rules in order. Then I began to circle. 1, 2, 3. I stopped walking and took a breath. The moment I turned away, I felt it behind me. I didn't look. I've never looked. But I could hear the man's breath, slow and hoarse like wind passing through a hollow chest cavity. He didn't speak. I forced myself to believe it was nothing. I was halfway home when I saw the woman in black. She was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes and watched her through the windshield. Her head was tilted like she was trying to hear something far away. Then she smiled, slow and unnatural, and walked into the woods beside the road. Not a glance toward me, just walked into the trees and vanished between them. When I got home, my neighbor's dog was barking wildly at my apartment door. The neighbor apologized, said his dog never acted like this. I barely acknowledged him as I went inside, slamming the door and turning the lock twice. I checked every window, turned on every light. When I passed the hallway mirror, I stopped. My reflection was blurry. Not the mirror, my reflection. Like it didn't want to form properly. It shifted subtly and wrong, like it was breathing at a different rhythm than me. I covered it with a towel and avoided that hallway the rest of the night. The money kept coming. My bank balance doubled, then tripled. New job offers appeared in my email without applying. One company said they were impressed with the project I led, a project I never worked on. My fridge filled on its own once. Groceries I never bought. Items I would have chosen sitting perfectly organized. My wardrobe gained new pieces that fit my size exactly. There was no doubt. The grave was feeding me, pulling my life upward. But it was also thinning the wall between what should be and what should never have been. And that wall was nearly transparent now. I tried skipping a visit once, just to see, just to reclaim some control. I made it 3 days before I caught her watching me through the keyhole. I'd heard the soft scrape of fabric along the floor at night and dismissed it. Then, during the 4th night, I got up to grab a drink and saw the doorknob twitch slightly. I looked through the peephole and she wasn't outside. She was inside. I pressed against the reverse side of the keyhole, perfectly still, waiting. I drove to the cemetery barefoot, wearing only a sweatshirt and thin joggers. The grave was surrounded by fresh earth, even though no one had dug. I stood 10 minutes, circled 3 times, left without looking anywhere but forward. Days passed. The insects returned, this time inside my apartment. I didn't kill them. I let them crawl along the walls, the floor, even the edge of my bed frame. One stayed perched on the ceiling above my pillow. Every time I opened my eyes, it was there, still and expectant. At work, someone new joined our department. A woman I'd never seen before. Everyone said she'd always been there. Her desk was opposite mine. She never blinked during meetings. She never typed. She never ate lunch. She just watched me. And I began to notice that whenever I checked my peripheral vision, I could see her mouthing something. No sound, just lips shaping the same phrase over and over. I didn't want to know what she was saying, but I started dreaming about her mouth. Wide open, blackened teeth and something pulsing in her throat, like a nest. One night I broke. I needed to understand. I went back to the grave after midnight and found the man sitting there. No eyes, pale skin that looked stretched too thin over a smiling skull. He tilted his head when he heard my steps and offered nothing at first. Then he raised one hand, pointed toward me, and said in a voice I still can't place whether it was internal or external, "You've taken more than you've earned, so now you must earn it." I didn't speak. I remembered Rule 1. I backed away, turned, and didn't look again. But when I got home, my bedroom was different. My bed was gone. In its place was a long wooden box. Not a coffin. Something older. Rough wood with fresh nails along its edges. On top sat a folded piece of paper that read, "Lie down and give thanks." I moved out the next day. New apartment. No forwarding address. I visited the grave twice the following week. The next time I returned, the box was there again. It had followed me. I tried skipping a visit for good. I lasted 6 days. On the 7th, I woke up in the dirt, lying beside the grave. There were fingernail marks in the soil around me like I'd been dragged. My lips were full of grit. My shoes were gone. And in the sky above, the birds had stopped flying. They were just hovering again, impossibly still. That was when I realized I would never leave this. I had accepted the grave's offer long ago, not with words, but with repetition. By following the rules, I had become its servant. Every circle, every visit, every reward was another chain wrapped around my life. I still visit, twice a week, 10 minutes, 3 circles. I don't speak. I don't question. The grave continues to give. But now each time I approach, I hear a voice beneath the earth. And last time, as I completed my 3rd lap, the ground shifted slightly beneath my foot. A shape, just for a second, pressed upward from the soil, human, mouth open in a silent scream, with my face. I don't know how much longer I can stay above it, but I know if I stop, it will pull me down and make me the new offering. That's the last thing it's waiting for. One more mistake, one more missed visit, one wrong number in the circle. Then I'll join the others. The rewards will pass to someone else. And I'll be the one reaching up from the grave, smiling with no eyes, waiting for them to speak.